Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of We Should Talk. And today I have a special guest, a very beautiful author, poet, Beatriz Hausner. Beatriz Hausner is a multifaceted author, so you can learn today in this new episode that we should talk. Beatriz born in Chile and immigrated to Canada very young, as a teenager. She has published many poetry books, including The Wardrobe, Mistress 2004, and recently Below Revolutionary, which I already read very recently. So let's go to welcome Beatriz to this episode today. Thank you for accepting this invitation.
Oh, thank you so much, Yannis, for thinking of me. I am just delighted to be here with you.
You're beautiful. Thank you so much. I am so grateful that you accept, because I know you have many hats. You work in many projects and very active life as an author. So when you say yes, it was a very honor for me. Thank you so much. Let's go to introduce Beatriz, this audience that we should talk. And I would like to start with a very back question about your childhood in Chile. I know you moved to Toronto when you were a teenager. So maybe if you can remember some specific smell or memory from your childhood house.
Oh, that's a very nice question.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, I was born in Santiago in 1958. Both my parents were, well, survivors of the Second World War. They were both of Hungarian descent and Hungarian Jewish descent. And so I was born when they were young, and they were very hopeful and full of energy about a future, because most of the people who lived through the catastrophe of the 20th century, both of them, they had a sense that there was a feeling of remaking of the world, and so I was born and I was raised in with this kind of energy that things would be better and could be rebuilt according to very, very good values. I don't remember very much of say the first 3 or 4 years. I do remember seeing my mother, who was she's alive, but at the time she was working in ceramics. She had a wheel, where they make that, and I remember it's a kick wheel, so she kicked it with her foot.
Oh, wow.
And I remember being inside there, like playing as though I were in a carousel,
Oh, that's beautiful.
That kind of thing. And I remember my father, we would go, he was a very athletic man, my late father, and he would take us on hikes up the mountains, because Santiago has the Andes sort of overlooking you and dominating everything. It's the most preponderant vision. You never see a horizon, or you don't have a sense of an open space. It's a very closed space. We would go up the hills, and he would, because we were so tired, he would carry me or whatever. It was a very wonderful sense. I had a feeling that the natural world was always there, because we didn't live inside the city, we lived outside the city. And there was, I remember the mountains being so majestic and overwhelming, and the sky was so blue, the sky of my childhood. I've never had that feeling again. The skies here in Toronto are so kind of leaden, they're not, they're kind of gray compared, even when it's clear. It's a very light blue, but because the Pacific Ocean is so close to Santiago, the the reflection of the ocean is very vivid. So the up is not unlike the down if you're near the ocean, you know?
Yes, yes.
So those are visual images. I realized when I was told this by a friend of mine who translated some of my work into Greek, that I have a preoccupation with ideas of the space.
Mm,
Spatial is very important for me, and I think it goes back to that kind of upbringing.
yeah, that's very interesting that you mentioned that, because I read some of your interview that you gave in another website, and I find something very similar about, you talk about the nature and also the space, and I was kind of wonder, because all our formation, I believe, start when we are child. All that uh, uh, philosophy things that we don't know, but they are instinct inside of us. So I I love to ask all the time about childhood, because I think that's the base for us as a adult later in whatever we are. And also, I would like that maybe you can share with us, if you can, of course. Um, I know music, it was very important in your, you say music and art, you surround yourself since childhood with that, if that have
Well,
been.
I mean, in my home, there was always classical music because
Mhm,
my mother's mother, my grandmother, was a pianist, and she couldn't really have a career because of the circumstances,
mm,
in that time, but also so there was always music in the house. And this kind of upbringing, that generation of Europeans were brought up
mm,
with an education in music, you know, so there was a lot of music in the house. And later, when we came here, I became, I mean, I grew up in a very strange home, you know. My mother and my stepfather are artists. They're very radical artists, you know. And so
mm,
my home was not the normal upbringing, you know. So,
that's good.
well, it is and it isn't. You know, it was good for me because I made it my life, but it's not so easy for my brothers, who would have preferred to have like a regular upbringing, you know, with a
Mm.
father who goes to the park and throws the ball kind of thing. But it wasn't like that, you know. So, but there was always music, and the visual too, you know, it was very preponderant because there
Mm,
was always the making of art in my home, and the making of poetry and the reading of poetry in certain ways. And so, in a way, my adult life and my occupation and my calling, thankfully, takes advantage of that upbringing, you know.
mm.
But later on, a young adult, I would borrow records from the local library. You know, we lived in a neighborhood of Toronto called Agincourt in Scarborough.
Yes, I
I
love
would
them.
go to the local library, which was in the mall, in the
Mhm,
Agincourt Mall, and I borrowed, for example, what would now be called soul music, but in those days it was called more like church music or gospel,
mhm.
and I found the rhythms and the melodies really wonderful. And I loved popular music. Even for a little while, we lived with my father on our way to Canada. We lived with my father in Mexico City.
Oh,
And I listen, and of course, everybody in those days listened to the radio, you know. And so there
yes.
were radio stations that played popular music. Like there was it was very funny when I watched when I saw the movie Roma, you know.
Yes.
In the background of that movie, there is a radio station called La Pantera,
La Pantera.
and I used to listen to that radio station. It was very, for me, it was very nostalgic. So
Oh,
here too, you know, you listen to certain radio stations like Chum or whatever, and then
yes.
in high school, you know, I got to hear some music, but eventually I became much more interested in my own as an adult in 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 music that is highly danceable. So because
Mm,
I'm a child of the 70s, and early 80s, and there's lots of really, really good music being
Yes,
invented then, you know.
that's the
Now it's
best
all
time.
turned into collage, and I'm not criticizing
No,
contemporary,
no.
no, but for me, music is rhythm, and it's also lyrics, you know. They have words, and those words are poetry, and so all of
Yes.
that works itself into your own kind of perception of reality.
Yes, yes, absolutely. I agree with you, and I love that because I am a melomaniac as well. I love music. I can survive with the music. Music for me is like a all day music.
Yeah,
And I will like, yes, connect the music, as you say, poetry, the rhythms, with your creative practice as well. Because I find your books are full, they're beautiful. I really highly recommend
very
because
much.
I really enjoy your poetry, and also I love the very freedom. I feel like it's so freedom. You talk about sexuality, about all our body as a female, as a goddess we are as a woman, you know? And also very connect with mythology as well. Music is, I love it. It's very powerful. Maybe connect how your process, your creative process when you write poetry, how that kind of music that you listen in the moment or you remember
Sure, sure.
connect with your.
Well, you know, I started out writing poetry, but then because of my growing up with a very great poet, I never felt very confident about being a poet in my own right. For a long time, I felt that about I had to learn about poetics in a way that wasn't really my making poetry. So for many years, I translated literature. I translated many, many wonderful writers, and from them I learned about writing. Because
That's
when you translate, that work becomes, you kind of carry it on you, you know. You can't internalize it too much sometimes because
mm,
it may be a voice that's very different from your own. But at a certain point, because I couldn't get my translations published in Canada, because there were Canadian publishing, it's changing a bit now because in
mm,
large part because of the work that I've done, you know, as an advocate for translation and an advocate for publishing translations. But at the time I couldn't find publishers. So it was very frustrating for me. And so I decided, well, you know, I might as well just do my own writing. And I felt ready, you know, and because I had a very, you know, like most women who work outside the home, I had a very demanding kind of lifestyle because I was working full time as a librarian and with ridiculous hours, you know, especially
mm,
after the 1996 takeover of municipal and provincial services by a very conservative government.
yes,
The library structure changed, you know, so my work changed and it became very, very oppressive. And so sometimes because I worked shifts, I worked late.
mm,
I mean, late, you know, till 9. Sometimes I'd have a couple of hours for myself in the morning, and everybody was out of the house, and I could turn on the music really loud. And, you know, I learned from a very important Canadian writer. So he taught me something very, very useful, which is that every writer, every creator, every person devices whatever plays tricks on themselves to release the creative, the imagination, the possibility of inventing things. Yeah. And for me it was a kind of listening to certain types of music that permitted a kind of trance-like
mm,
uh, moment, right? And then when you're in that kind of space, this is something that the surrealists uh, advocated for, and it's not very, very original, but it's a kind of freedom of the imagination, right?
yes,
And so to release, to be free, I would enter this kind of state, and then I could write. And I decided to write about things that were fun for me, like clothes, you know, because I've always been very interested in clothes. And I, you know, wrongly, because it's vanity. It's not that meaningful, you know.
No, it's not. It's what cover our body. Yes.
It's true, but in the sense that, you know, I grew up in Chile. We were very poor. You know, we didn't have, like now, even people here, when I was growing up in the 70s, you had a suitcase with 3 or 4 changes of clothes, and that was it, you know. But suddenly this became very available, and this is because I didn't have money to buy clothes as a young person in Canada, and I would go to secondhand stores, and I had fabulous clothes. So I decided to write about that, to use that as develop a kind of system of metaphors, right?
Yes.
It's comparative, where you express certain. So my first book, The Wardrobe Mistress, uses that idea, but also to express a kind of anger at the situation that I was in my workplace, a kind of rage, you know. And so it's a book that is got quite a lot of a kind of an almost tragic kind of undertone, but it's got all these brilliant little things, you know, like shiny things, right? And then I developed that idea even further. When in that particular book, I examined the idea of, I've always been very interested in automatons, in artificial people, yeah?
Yes.
And dolls, right? Like, what makes people do that, right? And there is a very famous story by E.T.A. Hoffman about a man called Coppelius who builds himself a wife, right? Wines her, right? It's the story of Coppelia, right? The ballet is based on this. So I wrote a poem in The Wardrobe Mistress about Coppelius. Like, what does it feel to be that doll, right? What does it feel to be at the hands of a person who creates you, right? So in my next book, called Sew Him Up, explore the idea of making yourself a lover out of sewing. And that poem is a very long poem called The Seamstress and the Living Doll.
Yes.
And there's more explicit sex. It's the idea of I began to explore the myths of creation. So the myths of creation that are explored by the Greeks, right? I don't have the book here with me, and it suddenly escapes me. But you know how the world was created. So the goddesses create the lesser gods, right?
Yes.
And so this woman, everybody has a goddess in them. Every woman has one or many goddesses in them, and it's just a matter of conjuring them. It's like a kind of magic. So I explored that in that book, and I also explored and I tried different ways of writing, you know, but I always was working with fairly short lines. A little bit before that book was published, I had this vision. I was sitting in my study, and I had been reading a beautiful, very, very interesting, very strange novella by a Cuban Baroque writer. The Cuban Baroque is a
Alejandro
Carpentier. No, I was thinking Severo Sarduy.
Severo Sarduy. Oh, my favorite.
He had a book called Cobra.
Yes.
And this book is very strange. You know, there is this character. This is written in the mid-70s or even earlier, and there's this character that is maybe transsexual or not. I mean, this is all before these things were understood, right? As they are now, normalized, right?
Yes.
So he invented a kind of situation, and there was this character that had a foot that you didn't know if it was real or mechanical. And so I had this vision of a human-sized raccoon that appeared to me sitting next to me, sort of behind me. And I thought, I'm going to write little things about literature or about I didn't have time to write long things because of my job. My daughter was smaller. And so I combined the idea of the little essay meditation, personal essay, with this idea of this character that I could bring into my life that could be a kind of lover or sex toy or just a companion or just an animal, right?
Mm.
And the strangeness of a wild animal. If you look at a wild animal like a raccoon in the night, they're very disquieting. They can be even repulsive to some people, you know?
Yes.
But there is a sense of that they don't really fit into our everyday life, into our
Yes.
constructions. Huh? And so I love that idea. And so I explored it more thoroughly as an erotic possibility. And then I changed, and then I kind of got stuck, you know. I needed to explore something else. I needed to write differently. And I took a workshop with a wonderful writer who was also my publisher, Jay Millar,
Oh,
on
yes.
Canadian long poem. And from these readings, including I have it up here,
Mm.
the poetry of B.P. Nichol,
Mm.
I learned to stretch the language, the expression, the diction, and so that I could write in longer lines, and really had to force myself to deepen, to make. But my challenge has always been like a self-imposed kind of construct is to I write fairly densely, you know.
Yeah, I love it.
But I don't I hope I'm not talking too much, but
No, 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 no.
no. So then I rediscovered, thanks to a friend who introduced me to the poems of a woman troubadour, a troubadouress,
Mm.
who happened to have my name. Her name was the Countess of Dia, they called her, but her name was Beatriz, with a T,
Beatriz.
like an old Provençal.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of the troubadour poets are the poets that invent the notion of romance,
Yes.
the celebration of the beloved, the putting up on a pedestal of the beloved. And so I explored that in Beloved Revolutionary Sweetheart.
Mm-hmm.
And even in The Wardrobe Mistress and in Sew Him Up, there's always references to popular music, right?
Yes.
Aretha Franklin or Sly and the Family Stone. Like, for example, Sly and the Family Stone, Sylvester Stone, it was his name, to me was such an important kind of musical poet. He was like a flame, you know, that just burned really brightly and then went out. Many of the artists of that period were self-destructive in a way that was very creative, even, you know, because they had such an intense
Intense.
burst of creativity, and then
Yes.
just went out like a light. Not unlike a poet like Rimbaud, you know, this is all part of a conception of the world that was sort of advanced and by the Romantic movement, by the Romantic poets, the German Romantics, the French Romantics. So, and then the symbolists. So this to me was really kind of cool, you know, and I could identify with that trajectory because you have to constantly choose not to self-destruct, you know,
Yes.
because the you know, women especially, you see, I think that we are so entrapped by our by Fran Lebowitz says that the only difference really is that we don't have testosterone, because testosterone gives you a kind of daring and nature and a natural drive to do things outside of the body, you know.
Yes.
The women have to protect the body because the body is where life is gestated, right? So you're constantly building protective layers. They are psychological, of course, but at the same time, these layers can act as barriers.
Absolutely. Yes.
Protect you, but they also prevent you from, because you can't, it's a kind of battle that I still feel very strongly, even though I don't have all these terrible burdens anymore, that there is a feeling that you can always fall back into a kind of inward stasis, a kind of depression, a kind of creative depression, a block, right? So in those books, I was constantly breaking out of that. I had a lot of luck. I had a lot of energy for many years. And in Beloved Revolutionary Sweetheart, I really explored it to its ultimate expression. Like, it is naked, it's erotic, it's about semen, it's the feeling that I could finally express desire. And the great inspiration for me, like my precedent, my my beacon, the person I aspired to be like, was a Peruvian surrealist by the name of Cesar Moro.
Cesar Moro, lo tengo aquí. Bueno, we have here.
Okay, so
Yes.
I mention him all the time because he taught me. He is the only poet I've ever encountered who expresses love for the other, for a man, in a way that I felt it to be. Because he was a homosexual poet. He had but he was unbelievably talented. So he could do it in a way that was very strange and inventive and energetic, So,
yes.
So that's where I was at with that book. A good book come out, a book that I worked a lot on. It's called She Who Lies Above.
Yes.
And this book is my most recent book.
Yes.
In this book, I am finally able to explore or express, because I've explored completely, what neoliberalism and capitalism has done to knowledge. Because I witnessed the disintegration of libraries, specifically in Toronto, where the public library movement was started in Toronto in the 1880s. So to have been part of a period of growth in the library where we nurtured the books, where the books were valued, beloved, selected carefully, bound, lined, classified, put on the shelves, and then come these librarians. I blame them, my profession. And they decide that this doesn't matter because it's too expensive to have so many people working with these things and the people who read them, right?
Yeah.
So they shrink the staff, they get rid of the books, right?
That's not nice.
And it's so of course it's not expressed like this in my book, right? In my book, I invent a biography for a philosopher called Hypatia. She was an Alexandrian philosopher, a Neoplatonist. So I invent a story of Hypatia, and the only evidence of Hypatia that exists to this day, Hypatia is a kind of feminist symbol, but the only evidence that exists are the letters that her student and friend wrote to her. So they're fragments, right? So Synesius was his name. So I invented a relationship between these two people. And this book works at a at a level where, at many levels, one of the levels is their correspondence. And inside that correspondence, we lead to other things, to these sections on the history of libraries, on the history of bibliography, all of these things that interested me enormously because I used the methodologies of book history to explore things like literary culture. In my nonfiction writing. So so it's, it is what you live, it is what you think, and it's unbearable for most people what I write, because I think it is, they're curious, they love the raccoon and all that because it's kind of fun, it's kind of strange, you know, but it's kind of the zeitgeist too, right? The idea of cybernetics.
Yes.
It's all
Yes.
very correct. I mean, I wrote that book practically 20 years ago.
I know. I read something that somebody say when you wrote I have that here in Spanish, La
Oh, yeah.
Metafísica del Agua.
Uh-huh.
When you read that, still raccoon, it wasn't that symbol from Toronto.
No.
And I love raccoon. For me, it was like our first conversation. It was about that. and
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah, no, raccoons are fantastic
yes,
animals.
yes, I think they are very important as well in ecology. And
Yeah.
as you say,
Historian, but I'm not a historian proper. Like I'm a literary, I'm a student of literature, right? But I don't write very literary work. My work is not informed by other literature, like say Borges. Borges was a very literary writer.
yes,
I collage, I take, and I put it all in there and work it out, you know, because I use the techniques of surrealism.
yes, and then
Prose, right?
yes,
There's a lot of prose writing. Some of it is poetic prose or poems in prose,
and prose.
and a lot of it is more like fiction,
Yes,
right?
that's right.
Or more like records. The idea of the archive, right?
Okay, yeah,
So people are very enamored with the archive, but really, once you become a professional archivist, which is a librarian, you know that there is a lot of stuff in there that's wonderful, and you can change it into whatever you want. The archive is everything. We are the archive, right?
yes.
So, but you know, it perhaps writing poetry changes in me too. Maybe I needed to do something more prosaic.
What do you mean?
As
Tell me,
opposed
tell us.
opposed to more lyrical, which is what verse is, right? It's more like song, you know? This is more like storytelling,
Yes,
more narrative. It's because I chose this weird multi-layered thing that I had to figure out how to work. It wasn't working for a long time. I've been writing that book since 2012, and I just couldn't make it work. So I had to settle. I had like this the story is told by Hypatia this way, then no, none of that worked. I had to kind of rejig it 2 or 3 times.
well, that's a good. I have one question like that.
Thread in it because
Yes,
it's such a very weird combination of elements, right? So the running thread in that book is alchemy.
Yes,
Because I'm a surrealist in the sense that I espouse the way of being in the world. I aspire to a kind of freedom of the mind. Okay. So the alchemists invented or used a kind of alchemy is the earliest form of chemistry. But
yes,
what they thought is that they could do something kind of holy with physical matter. Or not holy, but in a way transcend, like create a kind of super reality, right?
yes,
A perfect philosophical stone, right? A perfect thing, an object that was made, that was gold, like taking out of base materials the elements to create gold. This is what I think we do as human beings.
yes,
We create, like, the world, if it weren't driven by greed and money, and it were more honest to the desires of human beings, then we wouldn't suffer so much. We could create more gold.
that's true.
So the problem with, I'm sorry to be, I mean, I'm not a political person in that, in the sense that I don't belong to a party or anything, but the problem with capitalism is that it creates so much suffering. You know, you don't have to suffer to be in the world. You can be in the world without suffering. We have all the elements to do that. And yet we don't allow it to happen.
The
So
freedom. That's the part of
alchemy,
freedom.
that's right. And you're right. And so with the thing about alchemy is that it provided me with this kind of parallel system of metaphors, right?
Yes. The reason we start to write is to write what we really enjoy and how we like to be express ourselves. Could be totally freedom, no?
Yes.
If we start to limit ourselves as a creator, as an artist, I think the world at the end will be, how you say, never will know you properly, like you are, who is Beatriz Hausner.
Well,
so
it's
it's very
all fun and well, but in the
let it
end,
go.
like a friend of mine told me at some point when I was writing very surrealist stuff, he said, in the end, the poem has to be about something.
It's opinion. I really enjoy
But keep
surrealism.
that in mind.
Yes.
It communicates something that you develop in your head somehow, right?
I know but that's one of my questions here, because your literature published, you have been published with a large publisher, no, book house.
Well, it's what we call a medium-sized publisher, but it's an
yes.
important literary publisher.
Yes,
One of the very few that are left in Canada.
Yes,
because there were many, many more, but they've been basically starved to death by the Canada Council.
I know, with all the problem with publications. Yeah, that's another question I have here. How you find them as a Polish author? How you find how is navigate in this Canadian kind of lit, which is really. I find myself like a very hard to get in and publish and navigate. That's has to be.
It's a very terrible time for publishing. It's a terrible time for publishers, and it's by extension, it's a very terrible time for writers.
Of course.
Because there aren't, like, libraries used to buy at least all the Canadian books, right?
Yes.
Now they don't do that, right?
Yes.
The independent publishers have been absorbed by the multinationals. Like McLennan and Stewart was the crown and the jewel of CanLit, right?
Yes.
And then it was bought by Random House. And so when so much of the production is in the hands of a multinational, they're not interested in publishing an obscure poet, They're not, because they don't sell, they produce books as commodities, not.
I know.
So Canada has suffered because its policies were designed early on to foster a Canadian culture, and that's no longer the case.
Yes.
And everything else that is part of the ecology of the, let's call it the book, right? Can be in any format. It doesn't have to be in paper. Has fallen apart. So the distribution systems don't work because there are not enough bookstores, because the bookstores were also consolidated under the umbrella of this monster called Indigo, Chapters Indigo, right? So the booksellers, who used to be a very important bridge between a reader and the book. The librarian used to have that job. That was part of the job. It was called Reader's Advisory. So a young kid came having read something, you say, oh, have you looked at this other thing? Right? So, but once you remove those structures, either through a kind of consolidation of the market.
Yes.
Then you're left with the algorithms, and the algorithms do not provide you with the feeling of discoverability. They just swamp you with images and content that you don't generate.
Yes.
Right. So in a way, and this is the idea of fantastic writer who has just died, an essayist by the name of Yannis Lobain. We are living in a kind of slavery of content. And so everybody, not just as the end person, the recipient of this content, but if you want to create content, this is a huge intrusion. It's a kind of censorship of the mind because it's directed by a computer system, an equation algorithmic system.
Yes, yes. No, absolutely. This theme is a very serious thing that I really, I'm having discussed with other writers how we navigate this. And as I immigrant myself and emerging writer, author, I feel like it's no, if you, that freedom is not really freedom just now to publish whatever you really feel like is good or value to you, or you have to be like what things are in the market, or what if you want to be follow that path.
Publishing house, that was the idea of a friend called Luciano Jacobelli, the late, he was a wonderful writer and an excellent person at creating sort of community, right?
Yes.
His interest was in creating community through Quattro books. My interest was in publishing international literature and translation. And I tried to do it, but it didn't work because the problem is that we don't have, like, the Mexicans will happily publish Canadian writers, but we don't publish them here because there's no reciprocity.
Yes.
So it didn't work. It was very disappointing for me. At the same time, it was a very good effort because we developed, like, one of the things that I noticed when for many years, I was working as a user education librarian, a person who taught people how to use information.
Yes.
The advent of computers, that was the medium, right? So I realized that in the early days of the internet, the information was vertical, right? It was, you scrolled. Textual content was a scroll, right? Like in the old papyrus, right? But as the internet developed into a visual medium, it became a landscape. So that meant that you can't read as much in a shorter space.
Yes.
So textual content was necessarily going to have to change until the internet. People were buying, volumes this thick of, I don't know, novels, or collections of short stories. Like, they were thick. Like, those novels were huge in the 1980s, right? Well, nobody's going to read that stuff anymore. So I said to these guys, we would develop the idea of specializing in the novella. It's what the Russians called the long short story, and the French called the short novel.
Short novel.
And it's a wonderful genre because it requires enormous knowledge of how to write, because it's very hard to write a story that's not too long, but it's told, the whole story has to work.
Oh, yes.
The structure has to work in a shorter medium, right? Because what I noticed when I was a young person, a young writer, is that a lot of the novels, Canadian novels mostly, they were like very descriptive and they had a lot of dialogue. So I thought, well, if you're going to do description, just take a picture, This is what the surrealists believe.
Yes.
The whole point of creation is to transform the world, to transform reality. If you want the reality, just take a picture. We have the means to do that. So
Yes.
this is why I find that shorter novels are going to fit the time. But I think that for me, the most addictive type of narrative is the narrative that's told in film.
Yes, I love it.
It's so drama, right? The plays of old, dialogue has been replaced by film and television.
Yes.
Every book seems to come from a different place in a way, from a different moment, is informed by a different set of influences and energies. So I'm having a difficult time after the pandemic in writing poetry, pure poetry. Something happened in my spirit, and I believe in the spirit of most of us, in that interruption of our flow, right? Suddenly we had to be alone, or alone, maybe not alone, but we weren't part of a community, right? The community was only available in the most mediated way possible through computers. So it finally made it clear that we are in the machine. And I can't figure out how to get out of the machine, you know? So what I do is, lately, what I've been doing is I've gone back to listening to music to just let my mind cleanse.
Yes.
And I am going to try like more. I'm on Instagram less and less because it's a beautiful place, Instagram. It's like eating too much chocolate, you know? You're really satisfied but never satisfied, right?
Thank you
And
for
always
that.
have indigestion, right? Because you've had too much of it. So it affects the mind in a way, doesn't it? And so I'm somewhere between books, finishing books that I wrote in some fashion some time ago, but beginning other work. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for mentioning that, Beatriz, because that's one thing I have one question here about the social media as it's kind of contradictory sometimes, because as an artist or as an author, we need to be out there now to publisher find us. So we kind of feel like in that trap, the we all know, and the or rabbit hole or whatever they call. And because you don't know, for me, I put limit all the time. Even I am very active in social media, I must say, but I put limit, and I know what you explain.
Tell me what you do.
Oh, I have a timer in my phone. I have my phone turned off completely.
Really?
And yes, you can
set it.
Set it that in your phone, and I cannot go. Oh, you can go. Of course, you yourself. You can say no a little bit more, 5 minutes. But if you are serious with yourself, to be limit yourself, I say okay until tomorrow again. So anyway, that's something contradictory for us now as a creator, and I feel like how you can balance that, how you can maybe in your experience as an author, and also how technology and or creative process can be balanced, if that's possible. It's a long question. I know.
I'm not sure I have an answer, you know. I haven't found it, but it's a constant, it's yet another barrier that has been imposed on us.
Yes.
Creators to fight against. It's not enough that we have to fight against social injustice and poverty and limitations imposed, and you know, watching the horror of people who have to leave Venezuela because they have nothing to eat. Like, it's not enough to have all that tragedy, all that sadism, right? We also have to have this enemy in our brain, in our home, in our hand, in our home, inside our world. It's an enemy that's it's a fantastic tool, don't get me wrong.
Yes, absolutely.
But I mean, I go to the university library where I do a lot. You know, one thing that has worked for me is to study. Say I'm reading a book. I have to find a book that I really am interested in.
Yes.
And I take notes and I copy sections that are important to me or that help me in an insight. The important thing is to study, to learn something new.
Yes, that's very good that you mentioned that, because that's when the thing I encourage all the time when I teach to my student. I say, even you have the technology, but it's good to go to the library and use the books, the real physical books, and take notes or take photo, because sometimes you can screenshot and then read and keep it going. But research and study and learning the old-fashioned way, I think.
Yeah, because the ideas may not have any relation to the book you're reading, or the section of a book that you're reading, but they trigger thoughts. It's important to write. For me, it's important to write by hand because it helps my head somehow. But this is the only thing that I can do, that I can think of, that's really working.
Yes. I love handwriting as well. I always have my notebooks and pencil by hand all the time.
That's true. You know, a lot of people love notebooks, right?
Yeah, I need it. Yeah, I need it. I need my.
I mean, I go to the dollar store and I always end up buying notebooks that I don't know when I'll fill them up, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, but just to do the pre-writing, I always do like that. My ideas and some little short story or collage or whatever come to my. That's amazing. How was balance the creative process, your creative writing and life with having a family, having a daughter? How was that process, or what did you write during that time, if you remember?
Well, when she was little, I was doing mostly translation. And I had a lot of help from my husband, and I had a lot of help from people who a woman who I hired to look after her when I was at work, you know. But there's no question that motherhood implies less time for work in the creative realm, right? That there is no question. I mean, it's important to not let it go, because in the past, that's what people did. Women did that, right? They devoted themselves to the home and the family and didn't pursue their careers or their calling or whatever you want to name it. But I feel that I am very lucky to have had a child. It's an experience that is the most creative experience there is. It's creation, right? The creation. So you do feel like it's magical. It's extraordinarily beautiful. And it's also full of the thing about motherhood and parenthood that's so difficult is ensuring the well-being of your children, right? That they are healthy and that they don't suffer, and that it's all protecting them. I was a very neurotic mother. I was always afraid for my daughter, you know, and not good for her, not good for me, you know, but I couldn't help it. I couldn't help it. Yeah, it's like it's the greatest gift. And one thing about motherhood that was for me very, very positive is that because you have so little time, you become organized, super organized. Suddenly become this production entity. You have things going on over here, over there is the stove and the boiling water and the child and the phone call. It used to be a phone call before it was text, right? You know, the phone call and the job and the schedules and all that. You become incredibly organized. I did so much when I was running an organization, the Literary Translators Association. I was advocating, writing letters to the Canada Council. Like, you can't imagine how much stuff I did. When I look at my things, my papers, I think I forgot about this. And I'm sure this happens to you. You just don't remember because you never sleep, right? Like, you're always sleep deprived. I don't know, but maybe you had a fantastic child that slept a lot, but I could never sleep, and you never sleep again, right?
No,
So, but I wouldn't exchange it for anything.
that's very beautiful, Beatriz. Thank you for sharing that, because I know we all have different, of course, motherhood experience, because it's not all rose and beautiful moments. There, like you say, moment that we are kind of obsessed and preoccupied and has to balance that. And I'm always curious with how other parents, not only female, men as well, because some men take the role that be at home.
Yes.
Or I always ask that question, because you have to be, in that time you were president, the Literary Translation Association, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So balance that big work
Yeah.
with being a mother and young mother is.
But you know what I did is something that my parents did in my upbringing, which that I would have, say, meetings in my house of the committees, right?
Yeah.
And she was over there, like you're probably doing right now. She's over there playing and taking care of herself, right?
Yes.
You know that they're safe, so it's good. And anyway, everybody else meets them, and they are so impressed and so happy to meet Veronica and all this stuff. I would take her sometimes to meetings in Montreal, and she'd be over there, whatever. When they're big enough, you can do that, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, when she was born, 2 months after she was born, I took her with me to the Guadalajara book fair.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And, you know, she was a tiny infant, and she wasn't very good at sleeping yet. But all that, I hired a young woman to take her around in the little carriage.
That's good.
And look after her. And she slept the whole time, because the noise, the ambient noise of all those people talking and the sound and all that, no problem. It's when they're older that it's a problem, because they don't really want to be with you.
Be with you anymore. I know. I am almost there in that stage.
My stepdad, Ludwig Zeller, had this theory. Writers write because there just aren't enough people in the world willing to listen to them talk.
Yes, when you mentioned Severo Sadu, it was like, oh my God, that's one of my favorite.
You know, I was reading, you have a fantastic tradition. Like that Alejo Carpentier, I was reading a bit, and like,
it's amazing.
God, it's like reading Ulysses by James Joyce, you know, it's like, but super better, like even more beautiful, right?
Oh, I think Obsession is the André Breton.
Oh yeah, that was when I did my bio, right? Yeah.
Yes,
I'm still
I read that.
He's extraordinary. Like,
yes,
you can read him in little bits, because he's, I mean, talk about
I know
French and the rhetorical inheritance. I mean, they cannot write anything simply. But but wow, what an incredible philosopher, really. Well, not a philosopher, but what an ideas person.
Have you ever translate something the André Breton to English or Spanish? No,
I don't. My friend, you know, I could, but my French is just not. It would be so much work. Like,
yes,
I could do it if I were young and I had lots of time, right?
Georgia.
And I was really learning about ideas. But what I enjoy so much is what I'm finding so interesting in his writing is the period when he was in exile in New York, because I've been exploring the idea of exile, because in exile, different writers react differently to an artist, to the same thing. Human beings, right, react differently to some of it's like a paralyzing experience, and to others they find a kind of flourishing of their own internal processes. And he wrote such important work when he was in exile. he was in a terrible way. He was in a terrible situation because, I mean, he had been the most prominent intellectual in France.
Yes.
And suddenly he's like living in a walk-up in Greenwich Village. This is described by a fantastic scholar by the name of Anna Balakian, who visited him
Yes.
as a student at the time. And he's like a caged animal, you know? And his English is not very good. And he's got the whole of the French intelligentsia sort of against him because he left France instead of staying and fighting in the resistance, right? So he's got all of that garbage, all that political
Yeah.
shit, right, to deal with. But and his wife leaves him, and it's like really a lot
Yeah.
goes on, you know. He
I
goes
know.
out to the Southwest, and he goes to Quebec, to the Gaspésie, and he writes these fantastic things, you know. So yeah, what he does, what I like about Breton is that he taught all of us that poetry is not verse.
Mm.
It can be in any form. So there's a lot of ideas and nonfiction in his poetry too.
Mm.
He's also a lyrical poet. He is.
Yes.
But there is the lyric, right? But there is also this whole other dimension that's very inspiring.
Yes. Yes. I love as well. I haven't read a lot of the um, books about him and also biographies, and yes, and I love her. I love her too. And so grateful. I think it's a lot of things I would like to ask you and share with you and give you this space. I don't know if you have something else to share. If you, what do you read now? What inspired you in this moment?
Questions were really good.
Oh,
And I think I said a lot.
okay.
All I want to say is it's important what you're doing because we need to talk about the ways in which we can change the artistic and literary culture of Canada, because it's kind of stuck, you know.
Mm.
And I think that immigrant writers and artists bring with them other models. Like in other countries, we don't have to invent everything all the time. There's other writers who are there, you go and see them and they show you something and you can get ideas, and there's so much more exchange. So we need to invent something else that will work, whether it's digital publications or this kind of thing, podcasts, or what you're doing in that sense is really useful because there is a kind of a vacuum,
Mm.
right? The context is not there suddenly.
Thank
And
you.
so I think that is, for me, that's why I always, when somebody like you invites me, of course, I mean, it's an opportunity. That's the thing. There's an opportunity to change the world a bit, but how do we do it? I don't know. I don't know how to do it. Suddenly there is no answer, right?
Mm. That's well, thank you, Beatriz. I think um, I agree with you, and I feel the same. I feel like we need more community as well, more space for and also to express ourselves or talk about creation or life, and that's my aim with this program that I start to do myself. I have to do myself, but yes, the intention is that having a space to have for us as artists, writers, and community to express ourselves and leave that tone there. And you never know. It's like I like to open doors. That's one of my favorite things to do. Open doors and see what happened. What led that path? Oh,
Yeah, the door is open. So
Yes,
I could walk right in, right?
yes,
That's what you did. You opened this door. I'm really grateful.
it's beautiful. Oh, you are beautiful. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Have a great week ahead. And yes, thank you so much for
You're most
connecting. That's beautiful.